Can you railroad velvet? There's a lot to consider to answer that question. It's Mimsy here. I teach budget-minded people how to beautify and improve their homes with home decor, sewing, and DIY. And today we're going to talk about velvet and all of the characteristics of velvet and everything that you need to consider if you're going to use velvet for an upholstery project or some sort of home decor item. So I'm standing here next to this banquette that I am reupholstering for a client who is also a friend of mine. That's why I'm doing client work. I don't normally do this, and once I received the piece and received the fabric, I had a dilemma here because I didn't know, do I do this the traditional way, the proper traditional way, and run my fabric up the piece, up and down the piece like this and put in 2 seams? Or do I railroad my fabric and kind of go against upholstery tradition and kind of proper techniques as far as velvet is concerned? I really had a dilemma, and I've been going back and forth. I reached out to a few other upholsterers to get an opinion. I really looked at this fabric every which way, and I ultimately decided that I am going to railroad it, and let me tell you why. So first of all, let me explain to you what railroading is. So if you're going to railroad your fabric, you're going to run your fabric lengthwise across your piece of furniture. And you can only do this if it's non-directional fabric. So you have a solid linen or a solid cotton or a solid fabric where there's not any directional nap or pile or directional pattern. So if I had a fabric that had a pattern on it, let's see if I have something. Okay, so this fabric I'm using next actually. So this fabric, the pattern is running this way. Clearly the leaves and the flowers are growing up like this. I could not use this fabric like this. That would be everything growing down. That's wrong. And I could not railroad this fabric because it would all be growing sideways. This way I could possibly, but it's not right. You don't really want to railroad a fabric with a floral pattern and have everything growing sideways. So that's one example of a fabric that really can't be railroaded. And then velvet. Velvet generally cannot be railroaded because it does have a directional nap. And what I mean by nap is that feeling or the way that the pile is on the fabric. And this one has a very, very subtle nap. So you know how when you rub your hand across velvet and it feels really, really smooth going in one direction, but then going the opposite direction, it feels rough and like you're going against the grain, and that is because you are going against the grain here. Some velvets, when you rub your hand against the grain, you can see that mark, and it looks like a whole different color fabric when you do that. This fabric, however, is a performance velvet and has a low pile, and so when you rub your hand against the grain, you can actually barely see the difference in the color. And that's the reason why I decided to go ahead and railroad this fabric, because it has such a low pile and such a subtle nap to it. I decided to go ahead and railroad this. That's one of the reasons. The second reason is traditionally when you put a seam in velvet, you also include a welt in the seam. And this is going to be a high used piece of furniture in her home because it's her main eat-in kitchen area. And so I did not want to include welt, and I didn't want to put a seam because that welt would get really beat up over time. It would get beat up pretty quickly with kids sliding into a banquette and sitting on a welt. So that's the other reason why I decided to go ahead and railroad this fabric. So here's the velvet on the roll, selvage to selvage, and on this particular velvet, the nap runs up the roll or down the roll, whatever, up or down the roll like this. So you can see when I rub my hand and smooth it all out this way, this is the way that it makes it smooth. And then when I run my hand up like this, you can kind of see that it does change color a little bit here. I'll smooth it back out. So anyway, that's the nap of the fabric. And when you're using velvet for any upholstery project or any home decor sewing project, pillows or whatever it is you're making, you really have to pay attention to the nap of the velvet. Because if I were to connect two pieces together and one of them has the nap of the fabric running up the piece and the other one has the nap running down the piece, it will look like you've joined two different colored fabrics. They will look completely different colors. This one, however, because it is a performance, and like I said, it has very little pile or a very low pile and very little contrast, it looks very much the same whichever way you look at it. And I'll show you the view of it from both directions on that piece. So here's the piece from one direction, and then we'll move across it and look at it from this direction. So you might just think that the lighting is different, but this piece is actually parallel to my windows. So the lighting is evenly distributed across the piece. It's just the way that the light reflects on the threads of the cotton that it's reflecting the light differently and looking like a different color. And that's the nature of velvet. And that is why you have to use your velvet in the same, you have to join your pieces in the same direction, and I have to make sure that I connect all this fabric everywhere I'm using it all in the same direction. Otherwise it'll look like I'm using different fabrics, and that's including on the welting. So when I put welt on this piece right here to join my skirt, all my welt pieces have to be even in the same direction. Otherwise, your welt cord will look like it's two different fabrics on there. So you just have to pay real close attention to that nap when you're using velvet. So the short answer to the question, can you railroad velvet fabric on your piece, is yes and no. It depends upon whether or not your velvet has a really, really apparent or very high contrasting nap or pile. Mine does not. It's very subtle, the nap on my fabric. And if you have cushions where you have a natural spot where you can seam your fabric, then I would say run your fabric the correct way, or the traditional way, which would be up the piece or down the piece, and install a seam. Well, I hope that helped you. So if you want to see the process of reupholstering this banquette, you can just watch that video right here, and I'll see you over there.